Okay, guys, in this video, coming back, and we're going to start talking about, the economic base. We left off talking about the situation of Philadelphia, and then looking at the situation, in particular, of Chicago as an epicenter of commodities trade, and which becomes a major source of the economic base for the Chicago metropolitan area. And so, what is the economic base? And so, this is kind of where those economic geography aspects begin to manifest themselves in urban geography, and we have it. Within these urban centers, we have what we call the basic sector and the non-basic sector. And so the basic sector is that part of the economy that essentially brings in resources from outside the community. Okay, so it is, in the case of Chicago, it's that financial trade, or it's also the agricultural commodities trade and the food processing activities that were associated with Chicago, where those goods would then be sold, or those services sold, to people in other locations. So Chicago's providing particular financial products in the form of commodities, futures, and options, and was providing those to people from outside Chicago. So there's money coming in from all over the nation as well as all over the world into Chicago to take advantage of that market space. And then we have also the notion of the food processing activity, in which raw materials are coming in, those get processed, right? The cattle come in, they're slaughtered, they're turned into, all the different products that we see at the grocery store, in the meat counters, etc. And all of that stuff then flows back out into other parts of the country. And that is generating revenue that's coming into the Chicago metropolitan area. And the same situation is holding for other cities, right? There's a basic sector, and then there's a non-basic sector. The non-basic sector is sort of your service side of the equation, and particularly the locally administered service side of the equation, where you get goods and services that are produced on a local basis and are not necessarily sold out to the broader global, or national economic system, right? So they are contained within. They're part of the non-basic sector that gets in there. So this is going to be things like the grocery stores, or say, right, your the barber shop, the hairstylist, the nail salons, the restaurants, okay, and think of school teachers, right, a lot of your legal services, things like this. This is all part of the non-basic sector for the most part that goes on out there. And so the total economic base of any given city or urbanized area is the combination of the basic sector and the non-basic sector. And the key becomes that balance between the basic sector and the non-basic sector. The non-basic sector is entirely derivative of the basic sector. So the larger and more diverse your basic sector is as part of an urbanized area, the larger and more diverse your non-basic sector will thereby be. Therefore, we see within the case of New York City, which has a very large basic sector dealing with finance, banking, and other activities that are in there, it generates a lot of income that comes in, and that income is then dispersed through the greater New York metropolitan area. And then what do we see? We see the range of social and cultural activities that are available within New York City that aren't necessarily available in Knoxville, or much less a Morristown or something like this, right? So we see these activities that are going around and taking place, and they're generated based off of the basic sector, which allows for the non-basic sector to exist. So when we look at this, we also look at, we can look at different classification schema. These are generally usually tied to some sort of official schema for identifying industrial and manufacturing and goods and services production within those economies, and when we can actually then say, okay, this city or this urbanized area generated X amount of dollars that came in from a particular sector. Those particular sectors then contribute to the basic sector or the non-basic sector of the overall economy within that urbanized area, and we can then judge, is it in balance? Is there, is it very basic heavy versus non-basic? Is there room for growth? What's going on within that urbanized area from an economic standpoint as well? We then have the notion that there is a multiplier effect. And so we see this multiplier effect in play in a lot of places. You'll oftentimes see this played out if you're looking at something that's going to be coming down from, say, a county or city economic development office, and they'll often talk about, oh, we've gotten this manufacturer, this business is going to move into our community. It's going to be X amount of jobs, and those X amount of jobs, and then oftentimes what they do is they add in this multiplier effect to say the 1,000 jobs that they're going to hire at this firm is going to lead to 5,000 total jobs within our community, right? So what are they counting? They're counting that 1,000 jobs as part of the basic sector, and then they're saying, oh, well, 4 jobs in the non-basic sector are going to be created, say, for every job created in the basic sector. That's not really necessarily always the case. As it mentions down here, the typical ratio is 1 to 2. I've seen a lot of studies that say it's actually less than 1. Okay, so it depends on the nature of that basic sector and how that money actually comes in. But let's just suffice it to say it's generally nowhere near what your economic development agency is going to be putting out there or touting as the economic benefit of bringing this business in. Sure, it's great, it diversifies your basic sector, but don't expect a whole lot of additional non-basic sector jobs necessarily. So we don't actually see this coming to pass in a lot of places. It's generally maybe 1, 2 is really pushing it. So it's generally closer to about 1. I've seen a lot of studies that have seen 0.8, 0.9, things like this, maybe to 1.2. So there's one basic sector job will basically roughly create 1 non-basic sector job. We can kind of look at it that way, and that's probably a pretty good rule of thumb to look at. This just kind of gives it in graphic terms that are here. So as you can see, here we have our city population, and as we can see, as the population is going up, the percentage of the workforce that's going into basic sectors is actually thereby increasing, and so and so we see. Actually, I should say that goes the other way. So the basic sector is moving in smaller cities. More people are going to be employed in that basic sector, right? So think again, primary resource extraction activities, and then sort of the initial stages. As the population goes up, that percentage begins to decrease. It begins to decline. And what's going on is you're seeing an increase in the non-basic sector. So as we see cities get larger and larger and larger, the basic sector as a percentage begins to decline, and there's a greater dependence of the non-basic sector on the income generated by that basic sector. That's great, but if you can do that. However, if your basic sector becomes less and less diverse over time, that can be a real issue, particularly if that sector, right, or the particular economic sector that your basic sector is in, if there is a decline in that sector or an alteration or change in some of the fundamental economics of that sector, it can actually really harm the non-basic sector and intentionally the full economic vitality of your urbanized area. So a classic example on this are the Rust Belt cities, or what we call the Rust Belt of the United States. In particular, places like Detroit, Cleveland, Toledo, and some of these that are on the Great Lakes that were iron-producing cities, manufacturing cities, in particular like the case of Detroit, which was, has become synonymous with automobile manufacturing. Okay, well, as the automobile industry transformed and changed itself from, say, the Big Three and several other large auto manufacturers within the United States, going back into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, as the economic conditions for automobile manufacturing began to change globally, the fortunes of Detroit also then turned south. You had this move of the manufacturing out of central parts of Detroit and into the suburbs, and then actually moving into, eventually here in the 90s and the 2000s, into Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, places like this, right? So moving away from the centers that were up there. And as that basic sector has shrunk, the fortunes of Detroit have also shrunk, right? So the non-basic sector has taken a big hit in Detroit. In fact, Detroit is actually smaller today than it was in 1960, right? It's been steadily losing population now for decades. There are whole parts of Detroit that have effectively reverted to nature. that it's actually sort of in many places somewhat largely abandoned in many sectors of the urbanized area within Detroit. And this is kind of the manifestation, the physical results of what you get when the basic sector begins to collapse and the knock-on effect on your non-basic sector. So the basic upshot here is the more diversified your basic sector is, the more your non-basic sector is going to be healthy. The more your basic sector is concentrated on a handful or one or two primary basic sector activities, as those basic sector activities might change within a global economic context, you are going to face severe harm as well, not just to that basic sector, but also to your non-basic sector. For another example of this, now again on a much smaller scale or a smaller town scale, look at the fortunes of the coal communities across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. So as natural gas has largely supplanted coal as the dominant form of energy production, those communities that were largely dependent on coal extraction as their primary resource or primary component of their basic sector, as that has declined and decreased and gone away, the non-basic sectors in those communities have also suffered substantially as well. So we do see these spillover effects that occur as you're concentrated into fewer and fewer components of your basic sector. If that basic sector should have the economic foundations or the economic rug sort of pulled out from under it, the fortunes of your community then also go south along with it. And this is oftentimes what we see as a result, right? These what are called brownscapes, right? These industrial wastelands, these ruins of the old industrial, infrastructure that was existing in some of these places. That because that basic sector, that component of that basic sector, has now transformed and changed and has moved away, right? Where the rationale for that basic sector has collapsed. You see the industrial ruins that are in place as a result, and the resulting devastation that spills over into the non-basic sector that's out there. So you can actually see this in a lot of places. In Detroit, there are websites that you can actually go out and you can look at the ruined buildings of Detroit, and you can just see all of these artifacts of when things were going great, when Ford was headquartered down there, all these different places that were all intimately associated with the automobile industry in Detroit, and all of the communities that were reliant upon that sector, and all of the non-basic activities that were in there, and now they are largely in ruins. The buildings are abandoned, they're falling apart, things like this, as you can see, and the nature and urban fabric, the morphology of Detroit has followed suit and has changed as a result. This gives you an example of what actually happens when that collapses. So we see over here some like a retirement center, some new stuff that's being built up in here. But what you used to see here were block upon block of solid middle class family homes that are in this area of Detroit. And now you see whole blocks that are effectively, there are no homes. What's happening? The people left. The people died. There was nobody else to take the thing over. The homes become abandoned, and then they become drug dens, or they become targets for arson activity, etc. And the city has to go in and tear them all down. And eventually you come across to where there are maybe a handful of houses that are in there that look pretty nice, that may have been restored, but for the most part, you have a lot of blocks that are like this, with maybe one house, maybe two houses, a handful of houses, and a lot of empty, abandoned lots. And there are whole areas of Detroit that have a lot of this, and then a lot of just maybe empty and abandoned homes that are in there. And you can actually see, again, if you go out on the internet and you want to just Google the decline of urban Detroit or anything like that, you can see timeline photographs of neighborhoods and see them actually diminish and decrease and fall apart in the span of 20 to 30 years. And so it's really, this is sort of a dramatic illustration, but to some extent, you don't have to go to Europe to see the ruins of a civilization. You can go to Detroit and you can see what a ruined civilization starts to look like, right? It looks like Detroit. Abandoned buildings, empty fields, right? And, collapsing infrastructure all around you. That's kind of the classic, markers of a declining or declined industrial base and the collapse of a cultural element that's in there. So we do see that a lot in places like Detroit. This gets into then, though, okay, economic base, that's extraordinarily important, but what do these cities actually do, maybe beyond the economic activity that's going on in there? And so you have these particular functions that these urban centers actually are going about and performing that actually create or are part of both the basic sector and a lot of it being the non-basic sector activities that are going on in there. So you got the settlements. So go back to kind of why these settlements came about in the first place, and those get wrapped up into what we call central place functions. Okay, so central place functions, that is the central business district, so it's your primary sector, but then it's also then the extent of your non-basic sector and all the different activities that are going on that are in there, what we call the central place. You then have transport functions. So again, Chicago being sort of at that rail hub because of the importance of its central place functions also serves a major transport function. But this is also going to be explaining why you have cities located on coastlines that are going to be advantageously located because they are good port locations, things like this. So we see transport functions that then emerge over time. And then we have special functions that also exist as well. And all towns basically provide the first two functions, but not everybody is going to provide the third function that's in there. And we'll talk a little bit about what constitutes these special functions. So what we see here is a basic outline of central place theory. This was developed back in the 1930s by the German economic geographer Walter Christaller, and basically he was trying to explain the spatial pattern of cities within southern Germany, right? Why was Munich where Munich was, and what were the relationships of the sizes of the cities and their spatial location. And he created this basic sort of model that we see over here that explained the separation a little bit. And it was a highly stylized model, but he was able to come up with a reasonable explanation of why the cities within Germany were spaced the way they were, why they were located where they were. And a lot of that had to do with dominant cities and then other cities that were kind of filling in the spaces, and also then dealing with transport function and transport network connectivity that was in there. So we have this notion here. So we have our central city, and we have this green hexagons in here and these broader circles that are out there. And so you have a large city surrounded by some smaller, medium-sized cities, and then filling in the spaces a third order. And you can break that down into 5 or 6, 7 different layers or hierarchies of central places in the types of functions that they provide. As you get into this A class central place, you're going to have then, more and more and more of those central place functions that are going to exist. And as you work your way down the hierarchy, fewer and fewer central place activities that you're going to find. And this is sort of the explanation why you'll see a gas station in Wartburg and maybe a grocery store or something like that, but you're going to see the hospitals and everything else like that in Knoxville, and then you're going to have all your high-level medical specialists and things like that. Those are going to be up in Atlanta, Nashville, and places like this. There's an hierarchy that exists between those functionalities that exist. Excuse me. So cities also then, as we mentioned, the basic sector, non-basic sector, there are basic centers of production and services. The development of industry has been extraordinarily important in explaining what's been going on and why cities have actually even been coming into existence, particularly in places like the United States, or the growth of those cities. And as we mentioned before, those cities can grow, but they can also decline. As your non-basic and basic sectors are coming into play, and the basic sector might have some certain activities that are going on, well, what happens over time? You have the non-basic sector, and the basic sector might decline as the fortunes of the basic sector also therefore decline. The last little factor that you get are specialized functions. Okay, and Knoxville is a good example of that. So what does Knoxville have? Well, it had a couple of different things. For one thing, it used to be the capital city of Tennessee. It also used to be where the Supreme Court of Tennessee used to seat. But most importantly, it has the University of Tennessee. So that is a specialized function. So it's a city with a large public university. You then have the state capitals, right? So that gives Nashville a particular advantage. That's over there. Memphis also then has the University of Memphis. So we have these different exceptions that go on as far as these specialized functions. So county seats have particular advantages over the other locations that they're in, and then state capitals have their advantages as well, all of which come into play as far as being specialized functional attributes that are undertaken in these particular locations. So going to leave it here on this one, and we'll come back in and discuss a little bit more about urbanized areas and what's going on with systems of cities and how those exist in a globalized context. Thanks, guys.